I had spent years believing my Texas ranch home would always remain untouched by anyone's decisions but mine. My name is Mallory Harper, and nothing could have prepared me for the moment I stepped out of my car after a long business trip and heard the unmistakable crash of a wall being torn apart from the inside. The noise hit me first, followed by the sight of several workers moving through my living room with sledgehammers like they own the place. My father stood near the doorway and announced that the house was being expanded to create space for my sister's growing family, as if that explained everything, and as if I should simply nod along. It took me a second to register what he had said, because the shock spread through my chest so quickly that it felt almost unreal. I asked why no one had asked for my permission before making such a drastic decision on property that legally belonged to me, yet my mother turned away without a single word. She waved one of the workers forward and told him to continue, ignoring the confusion on my face and the frustration rising through my voice. The sound of another section of drywall splitting open felt like an insult, especially when I realized they had waited until I was out of town to start this entire operation. A tight, heated pressure built behind my ribs as I stood there, fully aware that a violation of my boundaries was unfolding in real time. They expected me to accept it without protest, but they were wrong. If you want to know how everything spiraled from that moment into the most painful confrontation of my life, make sure you follow along and stay until the end, because the truth behind what happened next changed my entire family forever. That evening, I needed answers because the situation had escalated far beyond anything I considered tolerable, and the uncertainty pressed on me with a weight I could no longer ignore. I called the construction company whose name appeared on the signs scattered around the property, and the representative who picked up spoke with the easy confidence of someone who believed everything was perfectly authorized. I asked him to verify the name on the contract, and he read it aloud without hesitation, saying the agreement had been signed by my sister, Camille Harper. The sound of her full name spoken by a stranger created a tight pressure inside my chest because it confirmed that my absence had been used in a way I could not comprehend. I confronted my father right after ending the call, and he responded with the same dismissive tone he had used earlier in the day, saying the expansion was necessary for the sake of the family. He explained that Camille needed additional space before the baby arrived, claiming I should show more understanding instead of making things more difficult during a time he considered delicate. His argument felt like a rehearsed justification, and the more he spoke, the clearer it became that he expected me to ignore the breach of trust simply because it was convenient for him. I asked for the contract because I needed to see what had been submitted in my name. When the representative emailed me a scanned copy, I opened the file immediately and studied the signature at the bottom of the document. The handwriting looked almost identical to mine, yet the closer I examined the strokes, the more obvious it became that subtle inconsistencies revealed a deliberate attempt to replicate my style. Each curve seemed carefully constructed, which made the realization even more unsettling because someone had spent time practicing my signature. The room felt strangely silent while I tried to absorb the truth, and the mix of violation and disbelief created a slow burn behind my ribs. My mother reacted with irritation when I told her what I found, and she insisted I was overreacting in a way that made the situation harder than necessary. She told me Camille needed support and not conflict, urging me to stop complicating an already stressful moment for the family. Her tone suggested that my boundaries were unreasonable, and the speed with which she dismissed my concern revealed how little she acknowledged my ownership of the house. I attempted to express how serious the situation was, yet Mom turned away exactly as she had earlier, making it clear that she did not intend to engage with any explanation I offered. I spent several minutes debating whether I should take the next step, although a part of me already knew the only responsible choice was seeking legal guidance from someone who would take my concerns seriously. I contacted my attorney Avery Collins, and she agreed to meet me at her office within the hour because the issue involved potential misuse of legal documents. When I arrived, I explained everything that had happened with as much clarity as I could manage. I showed her the contract, the signature, the timeline, and the email confirmation from the construction company. Avery reviewed the paperwork carefully, occasionally pausing to examine specific segments that raised questions about the legitimacy of the authorization. After several minutes of quiet focus, she closed the file and told me the situation appeared far more serious than a misunderstanding between family members. She explained that using a falsified signature to initiate construction on someone else's property could qualify as a violation of state law concerning document authenticity and consent. Avery added that the combination of unauthorized construction, forged paperwork, and involvement from multiple individuals strengthened the case significantly. I listened without interrupting because her words confirmed the severity of what I already feared. She said the next step required gathering every piece of communication connected to the project, including texts, emails, and receipts, to build a clear timeline that demonstrated I had not given approval. I left her office with a mixture of relief and heaviness, because although I finally understood the legal implications, I also realized the situation would only become more complicated from this point forward. Avery advised me to remain firm, document everything, and avoid direct confrontation until she could prepare the necessary filings. The night felt strangely calm as I drove home, yet my mind remained full of questions I could not escape. 2 days later, a shift occurred that revealed how quickly a private conflict inside one household could spread far beyond its walls. I woke up to several missed calls from relatives I had not spoken to in months, which immediately raised my concern since none of them reached out unless something dramatic was taking place. When I opened my social media accounts, I discovered a long post written by Camille in which she portrayed herself as the victim of a sister who had abandoned her during a vulnerable moment. She claimed that I refused to help her while she was facing challenges late in her pregnancy, and she implied that I treated my family with coldness during a time she described as emotionally fragile. Reading her version of events created a slow wave of disbelief because every sentence framed me as someone entirely disconnected from reality. The post had already spread through extended relatives, and countless comments appeared beneath it expressing sympathy for Camille's struggle. Many people wrote that I should feel ashamed for leaving her without support, and they repeated her statements as though they were unquestionable truths. I felt a heaviness settle over me because the narrative had spread too far for a quick correction, and the number of people believing her version increased by the minute. None of them knew that a falsified signature had been used to alter my home, yet they reacted with the certainty of people who believed they understood every detail. Later that afternoon, I noticed subtle changes in the way several neighbors interacted with me. Some offered polite greetings but avoided further conversation, while others watched me with an expression that suggested quiet judgment. The shift felt unsettling because my community had always maintained a sense of surface-level civility, which now felt strained by Camille's accusations. It became clear that people had read the post and accepted it as fact, and those who once greeted me with casual warmth now appeared guarded. I realized how quickly a fabricated story could influence people's behavior in ways that created isolation, even without direct confrontation. As the day continued, messages began to fill my inbox. Some were harsh and accused me of lacking compassion, while others suggested I had created unnecessary conflict during a time that demanded unity. A few messages were even more aggressive, questioning how I could disregard my own sister in such a calculated way. Every message seemed to echo Camille's claims, and with each notification I sensed the distance growing between myself and the community I once trusted. The misinformation had taken a life of its own, and I understood that responding emotionally would only make matters worse. I contacted Avery because I needed guidance to navigate the situation without escalating the tension. She listened to everything I described and reminded me that public reactions often move faster than truth, which made the collection of evidence more important than immediate defense. Avery advised me to avoid posting any response online because an impulsive statement could be misinterpreted or used out of context in a legal setting. She stressed that silence did not mean surrender and the stronger choice was to maintain composure while ensuring that every piece of evidence was documented carefully. Following her advice, I began saving screenshots of Camille's post, along with the comments that repeated her claims. I archived every message sent to me, whether supportive or critical, because each one demonstrated the impact of misinformation. I also captured the timestamps to establish a clear timeline, showing how quickly the narrative spread and how it influenced the reactions of people in my surroundings. Gathering these details required emotional patience, yet it provided a sense of control at a time when everything seemed unstable. As evening approached, I reviewed the collection of files stored on my computer and realized they represented more than proof of wrongdoing. They reflected how deeply Camille had chosen to distort the situation in order to portray herself as the injured party. The realization created an uneasy quiet inside me because the damage had moved far beyond our personal dispute. I closed my laptop with the understanding that the situation had entered a phase where public perception and legal consequences would collide, and I needed to remain steady as the next developments approached. By the end of the week, a development surfaced that signaled how deeply the situation had begun to entangle far more than personal disagreements. When Avery informed me that she had filed the request for a full review of the construction permits, I expected the county to respond eventually, yet I did not anticipate their arrival as quickly as they came. The inspector contacted me early that morning and explained that he needed access to the property to conduct an official evaluation. I agreed without hesitation because the entire ordeal had already grown into something that demanded external oversight rather than private confrontation. When the inspector arrived, he moved with the focused attention of someone accustomed to navigating complicated disputes involving property rights and regulatory compliance. I guided him toward the partially altered area, and he began reviewing the documents he had brought from the county's records. His questions were precise and directed at clarifying the authorization process, which required me to recount details about the signatures and my absence during the construction's initiation. Each answer strengthened his concern because it became clear that the paperwork contained inconsistencies that should never have passed the initial approval stage. He examined the construction plans that had been submitted under Camille's name, and his expression shifted as he analyzed the diagrams more closely. He pointed out structural changes that failed to meet safety guidelines required by the county, and he explained that several modifications indicated a disregard for foundational stability. His words carried a weight that made my stomach tighten because the violations were not minor errors, but significant deviations that placed liability on whoever had submitted the documents. Hearing those concerns articulated by someone with official authority solidified the seriousness of the situation in a way I had not yet fully processed. After completing his inspection, he informed me that the ongoing work would need to stop immediately due to the severity of the irregularities. He stated that any portions already constructed without proper compliance would have to be dismantled to prevent safety risks and to adhere to county regulations. His tone remained professional, yet the firmness in his conclusion left no space for negotiation. He added that the person listed on the documents, which was Camille, would be required to respond to the county's request for clarification regarding the discrepancies and the apparent misuse of authorization. Later that afternoon, Dad arrived at the house after hearing about the inspection, and his frustration surfaced the moment he stepped inside. He insisted that the county was overreacting and claimed that my involvement had escalated matters beyond necessity. He repeated that everything would have resolved itself if I had simply cooperated and allowed the project to continue. His ability to overlook the forged signature, the regulatory violations, and the disruption to my home revealed a level of denial that made the conversation almost impossible to navigate. I attempted to explain the inspector's findings, yet Dad dismissed each point with the same refrain that I was making things harder than they needed to be. Camille contacted me shortly after Dad left, and her tone carried a mix of defensiveness and irritation. She questioned why the county had reached out to her and insisted she had followed instructions given by someone at the construction company. When I mentioned the issues found in the plans and the requirement for her to provide explanations, she reacted with indignation, claiming the situation had been twisted to make her look irresponsible. Her response made it evident that she refused to acknowledge the seriousness of the violations or the consequences of submitting inaccurate documents on a property that did not belong to her. As the evening settled, I reviewed the inspector's written notice and felt a shift inside me as the reality became undeniable. The conflict had grown larger than the strained dynamics within my family, and it now occupied the space of legal accountability and regulatory scrutiny. The county's involvement meant the situation could no longer be dismissed as a simple misunderstanding or emotional dispute. It had transformed into a matter that required formal resolution, and the weight of that realization settled heavily as I prepared myself for the next steps that would inevitably follow. Early the following week, the tension reached my doorstep in a way I had tried to avoid. My father arrived without calling, standing at the edge of the porch, with an expression that suggested he had already decided who the villain of the story was. He spoke with a tone that carried the weight of expectation rather than concern, insisting that I needed to withdraw every complaint, because according to him, I was feeding unnecessary conflict into our family. He emphasized the word family as if saying it loudly enough could erase every violation of trust I had been forced to confront. I listened quietly while he attempted to frame the entire situation as a misunderstanding that I had somehow escalated, even though the forged signature and the unauthorized construction had never been my doing. When I told him I would not undo the legal steps already taken, his disappointment shifted into a subtle threat disguised as fatherly advice. Mom appeared shortly after walking into the living room with a purposeful calm that contrasted sharply with the sharpness in her words. She accused me of abandoning my obligations as a daughter, claiming that any good person would prioritize their sister's needs over property lines and legal documents. Her voice carried a rehearsed sadness that felt crafted to provoke guilt, and she repeated that I was the only person standing in the way of Camille's comfort. I answered with as much restraint as I could manage, explaining that my boundaries had been violated so deeply that ignoring the situation would only reward their disregard for me. Mom shook her head, as if I had confessed to a crime, insisting that sacrifice was part of being in a family, yet she never acknowledged that I had already sacrificed far more than they cared to admit. The conversation deteriorated as soon as I mentioned the forged signature. Both of them dismissed the severity of it by suggesting that Camille had been overwhelmed and had acted under pressure as though stress could justify fraud. Their refusal to recognize the seriousness of the situation clarified something I had been trying not to accept. They had chosen a side long before I even discovered the truth, and nothing I said would shift their loyalty away from Camille. They insisted that I let county officials handle the mistakes quietly, and Dad even suggested that I be reasonable for once, a statement that revealed more about how he viewed me than he realized. Not long after my parents left, Camille sent a new series of emails that dripped with hostility. She wrote as if she were the injured party and accused me of humiliating her by involving authorities. She insisted that I had ruined her stability at a vulnerable moment in her life, even though she had initiated every action that now placed her under legal scrutiny. Each email grew more aggressive, revealing how unwilling she was to confront the consequences of her choices. I saved every message without responding, because any reply would only strengthen her narrative that I was attacking her. I forwarded the emails to Avery, who reviewed them carefully before confirming that we were moving toward a point where legal action would likely be unavoidable. Avery explained that the pattern of pressure manipulation and documented hostility strengthened the case, especially in combination with the forged signature and the irregular permits. Hearing her assessment helped steady my resolve more than I expected. It validated the instincts I had been doubting while navigating the emotional weight of my family's reactions. By the end of the day, something settled firmly in my chest. The distance between my parents and me had grown beyond simple disagreement. Their willingness to excuse fraud, redirect blame, and attempt to coerce me made it painfully clear that the relationship we once had could not survive this. I understood that moving forward meant accepting the loss while protecting my home, my autonomy, and every boundary they had tried to erase. A few weeks later, the first hearing finally moved forward under a tense atmosphere that none of us could escape. The courtroom carried a quiet weight when I stepped inside with Avery, who had spent the previous nights preparing a set of documents so thorough that even I felt overwhelmed by the precision. The judge requested all parties to submit their identification, and it was during that moment that I saw Camille seated beside her husband Blake, who kept his arms crossed with an expression suggesting he already believed the outcome should favor them. I focused on my own seat, determined to stay composed, while the clerk began organizing the folders that contained every detail of my case. The proceedings opened with a review of the property records. The judge examined the deed, mortgage history, renovation permits, and a series of notarized statements that confirmed the ranch house belonged exclusively to me. The confirmation came through a formal acknowledgement that established my sole ownership without any shared rights or contested financial claims. Camille shifted uncomfortably when that conclusion was read aloud, and Blake leaned toward her as if searching for a way to redirect the energy in the room. The judge moved on to the issue of unauthorized construction. Avery presented the signed contract, the matching handwriting samples, and a timeline showing when the document had been submitted without my knowledge. The expert's analysis confirmed the signature was altered using deliberate techniques rather than careless imitation. Camille attempted to defend herself by claiming she acted out of desperation during her pregnancy, but the judge noted that emotional difficulty could not justify falsifying official documents. Blake tried to intervene with a statement about family cooperation, yet the judge reminded him he was not the primary party in the dispute and asked him to remain silent unless directly addressed. The financial section of the hearing grew heavier when the judge revealed that Dad had provided substantial support to Camille during the process of modifying the documents. Bank transfers, electronic correspondence, and shared drafts of the incomplete permits all suggested that he had helped her understand which fields needed to be altered to create the appearance of my consent. The judge declared that this level of involvement required financial supervision until the investigation closed, which left Dad visibly stunned. Mom lowered her gaze as the judge addressed her next, explaining that attempting to submit incomplete and incorrect applications could result in administrative penalties for willful cooperation. The next portion addressed the civil consequences of the construction. Camille was ordered to reimburse the costs of demolition restoration inspection fees and any future structural assessments. The judge specified the amount as a mandatory obligation rather than a voluntary agreement. Camille whispered to Blake with clear frustration, yet Blake's expression tightened as he received the notice indicating the court would monitor their payments for compliance. The final decision covered personal safety and boundaries. Based on the online harassment, the pressure imposed at my home, and the escalation caused by emotional manipulation, the judge approved a 2-year no-contact order between me, Camille, and Blake. The order prohibited physical contact, digital communication, indirect messages through family members, and unapproved visits to my property. Camille protested by insisting I had misinterpreted her intentions, but the judge cited the accumulated evidence of disrespect and coercion and denied her request for reconsideration. When the hearing concluded, I stepped outside the courthouse with a sense of air returning to my lungs for the first time in weeks. The decision did not bring celebration yet. It created clarity that allowed me to understand the real cost of protecting my boundaries. I walked to the parking lot with a quiet realization that the version of family I had once tried to preserve no longer existed, and what remained was a difficult acceptance that some relationships break long before the final verdict is read. Months later, the consequences of everything that happened began to show themselves in ways I had only imagined during the hearings. I started seeing small shifts at first, yet each one revealed how deeply the situation had altered the direction of the people involved. Camille appeared to face the most immediate impact when she was forced to sell her car to cover the fines, fees, and compensation ordered by the court. The sale strained her finances more than she expected because several payments had already fallen behind, and the loss of the vehicle significantly affected her routines. Blake struggled with the adjustments and tried to negotiate different arrangements, although none of his attempts changed the obligations they owed. Dad ran into problems when he attempted to refinance a personal loan, and the county's violation record unexpectedly appeared during the review. The representative handling the file asked him questions he could not answer without admitting involvement, which resulted in the request being denied. He later tried to apply for a smaller credit line, only to face another rejection, because the violation remained visible in the system. The stress seemed to affect him more than he let on, yet he avoided discussing the issue with me, and I stopped expecting any conversation that resembled accountability. Mom encountered difficulties within the local community after details of her participation in the paperwork incident spread further. A few people confronted her privately, and others chose to distance themselves without saying anything directly. She appeared frustrated by the sudden change in how people interacted with her, though she insisted that neighbors were overreacting. Her frustration seemed to grow each time she realized another bridge had quietly faded and the shift in her social circle became irreversible. During that period, I focused on repairing the ranch house and restoring the structure to a safe condition while coordinating with the professionals Avery had recommended. The process took longer than expected because several sections required complete removal before reconstruction. I learned more about the property than I ever had before, and each corrected issue felt like a step toward reclaiming the stability I had temporarily lost. Even though supervising the work consumed most of my energy, the steady progress helped me feel more grounded after months of tension. In the middle of all the repairs, my best friend Tessa Monroe visited to help me regain emotional balance. She listened carefully when I explained the latest developments, and her calm presence made the environment feel less heavy. Tessa avoided pushing opinions or trying to direct my decisions, and focused instead on creating a safe space for me to process everything. Her approach allowed me to acknowledge the exhaustion I had been carrying, which I had ignored, while concentrating on the legal steps and the reconstruction. She stayed only for a short visit, yet the conversation eased a weight I had not realized had grown so heavy. After Tessa returned home, I continued the restoration with more clarity. I no longer carried the hope that my family would repair the damage they created, and the emotional distance between us became final. Watching each repaired section of the house reminded me that moving forward required letting go of expectations that no longer served me. The realization settled slowly, yet it felt honest. By the time the final inspection passed, I understood that whatever connection I once believed we had no longer existed. The ranch house belonged entirely to me again, and my life finally began to feel steady without the weight of their involvement. A gentle shift unfolded over the next year as the rhythm of my days settled into something steadier than anything I had known before, and I finally felt ready to breathe without expecting another intrusion. I had rebuilt enough parts of my life to understand that peace rarely arrives loudly. It grows one quiet choice at a time. The ranch became the place where those choices shaped an entirely new beginning. I invested the first months into restoring every corner that had once carried traces of conflict because I needed my home to feel untouched by anyone who had tried to claim it. The repairs expanded into improvements after I met a seller who owned the adjacent lot and wanted to close quickly due to a relocation. I realized that owning the land beside mine would guarantee permanent control over my boundaries, so I purchased it without hesitation. The additional acres gave the ranch a sense of space I had not imagined before. I designed a small orchard on one side, created a long walking path lined with wildflowers, and added an outdoor studio where I could work without feeling confined. My focus shifted toward nurturing the version of myself that had been overshadowed for years. I stopped apologizing for making decisions that protected my well-being. I declined invitations from people whose presence stirred old anxieties, and I reserved my energy for relationships that felt supportive instead of demanding. It took time, yet my professional life improved as I learned to manage stress in healthier ways. I approached each project with clarity instead of carrying emotional weight that never belonged to me. There were days when memories of Camille appeared without warning. Sometimes they arrived through old photographs that I found at the back of a drawer. Other times they surfaced whenever legal documents from the previous year required archiving. Those reminders no longer left me shaken. They simply confirmed that distance was necessary. I had not spoken to Camille Dad or Mom since the final hearing. That silence created an emptiness I did not anticipate yet. The absence also gave me a kind of stability I had never experienced within that family. It felt strange to admit that peace sometimes looks like losing people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. My best friend Tessa visited several times throughout the year. She never brought up anything related to the legal situation because she sensed I needed space to move forward without being pulled backward. Instead, she helped me plant the first row of fruit trees, encouraged me to try new recipes, and shared evenings on the porch, discussing workbooks and plans that did not include conflict. Her presence reminded me that belonging does not depend on shared blood. It depends on shared respect and genuine care. The more time passed, the more I understood that healing is not a single moment, but a sequence of choices that gradually rebuild the pieces of a life. Some mornings I watched the sun rise over the expanded field, and I sensed a quiet pride rising with it. I had survived betrayal inside the very place meant to shelter me, then transformed it into a home that truly reflected who I was. I learned to measure progress not by perfection, but by the growing number of days when I felt safe. I reached a point where forgiveness lost its urgency because I no longer needed it to move on. I reclaimed my home, my boundaries, and the dignity that had once been dismissed. The ranch became the strongest reminder that my life belongs to me alone. The experience taught me that boundaries are not acts of rejection, they are acts of survival. I learned that protecting my peace is not selfish, and that choosing distance from people who repeatedly harm me is sometimes the only path that keeps me whole. I finally understood that healing happens when we stop begging for respect and start building a life that reflects our worth, not someone else's expectations. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey. Your time and attention mean more than I can express, especially because stories like mine can be difficult to hear yet deeply relatable to many people. I appreciate every listener who values emotional honesty and personal growth. I hope my experience offers clarity, strength, and comfort to anyone learning to protect their peace and rebuild their life with confidence.